Chapter 5. Phone Booth. Jack parked the VW in front of the Rexall in the Table Mesa shopping center and let the engine die. He wondered again if he shouldn't go ahead and get the fuel pump replaced, and told himself again that they couldn't afford it. If the little car would keep running until November, it could retire with full honors anyway. By November, the snow up there in the mountains would be higher than the Beetle's roof. Maybe higher than 3 Beetles stacked on top of each other. I want you to stay in the car, Doc. I'll bring you a candy bar. Why can't I come in? I have a phone call to make. It's private stuff. Is that why you didn't make it at home? Check. Wendy had insisted on a phone in spite of their raveling finances. She had argued that with a small child, especially a boy like Danny, who sometimes suffered from fainting spells, they couldn't afford not to have one. So Jack had forked over the $30 installation fee, bad enough, and a $90 security deposit, which really hurt. And so far the phone had been mute, except for 2 wrong numbers. Can I have a baby Ruth, Daddy? Yes. You sit still and don't play with the gear shift, right? Right, I'll look at the maps. You do that. As Jack got out, Danny opened the Bug's glove box and took out the 5 battered gas station maps: Colorado, Nebraska, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. He loved road maps, loved to trace where the roads went with his finger. As far as he was concerned, new maps were the best part of moving west. Jack went to the drugstore counter, got Danny's candy bar, a newspaper, and a copy of the October Writer's Digest. He gave the girl a 5 and asked for his change in quarters. With the silver in his hand, he walked over to the telephone booth by the key-making machine and slipped inside. From here, he could see Danny and the Bug through three sets of glass, the boy's head bent studiously over his maps. Jack felt a wave of nearly desperate love for the boy. The emotion showed on his face as a stony grimness. He supposed he could have made this obligatory thank you call to Al from home. He certainly wasn't going to say anything Wendy would object to. It was his pride that said no. These days, he almost always listened to what his pride told him to do, because along with his wife and son, $600 in a checking account and one weary 1968 Volkswagen, his pride was all that was left. The only thing that was his. Even the checking account was joint. A year ago, he had been teaching English in one of the finest prep schools in New England. There had been friends, although not exactly the same ones he'd had before going on the wagon. Some laughs, fellow faculty members who admired his deft touch in the classroom and his private dedication to writing. Things had been very good 6 months ago. All at once, there was enough money left over at the end of each 2-week pay period to start a little savings account. In his drinking days, there had never been a penny left over, even though Al Shockley had stood a great many of the rounds. He and Wendy had begun to talk cautiously about finding a house and making a down payment in a year or so. A farmhouse in the country. It takes 6 or 8 years to renovate it completely. What the hell, they were young and they had time. Then he had lost his temper. George Hatfield. The smell of hope had turned to the smell of old leather in Cromert's office. The whole thing like some scene from his own play. The old prints of previous Stovington headmasters on the walls. steel engravings of the school as it had been in 1879, when it was first built, and in 1895, when Vanderbilt money had enabled them to build the field house that still stood at the west end of the soccer field, squat, immense, dressed in ivy. April ivy had been rustling outside Cromart's slit window, and the drowsy sound of steam heat came from the radiator. It was no set. He remembered thinking it was real. His life. How could he have fucked it up so badly? Well, this is a serious situation, Jack. Terribly serious. The board's asked me to convey its decision to you. The board wanted Jack's resignation, and Jack had given it to him. Under different circumstances, he would have gotten tenure that June. What had followed that interview in Cromart's office had been the darkest, most dreadful night of his life. The wanting, the needing to get drunk had never been so bad. His hands shook. He knocked things over, and he kept wanting to take it out on Wendy and Danny. His temper was like a vicious animal on a frayed leash. He had left the house in terror that he might strike them. He ended up outside a bar, and the only thing that had kept him from going in was the knowledge that if he did, Wendy would leave him at last and take Danny with her. He would be dead from the day they left. Instead of going into the bar, where dark shadows sat sampling the tasty waters of oblivion, he had gone to Al Shockley's house. The board's vote had been 6-1. Al had been the one. Now he dialed the operator, and she told him that for $1.85, he could be put in touch with Al 2,000 miles away for 3 minutes. Time is relative, baby, he thought, stuck in 8 quarters. Faintly, he could hear the electronic boops and beeps of his connection sniffing its way eastward. Al's father had been Arthur Longley Shockley, the steel baron. He had left his only son Albert a fortune and a huge range of investments and directorships and chairs on various boards. One of these had been on the board of directors for Stovington Preparatory Academy, the old man's favorite charity. Both Arthur and Albert Shockley were alumni, and Al lived in Barr, close enough to take a personal interest in the school's affairs. For several years, Al had been Stovington's tennis coach. Jack and Al had become friends in a completely natural and uncoincidental way. At the many school and faculty functions they attended together, they were always the 2 drunkest people there. Shockley was separated from his wife, and Jack's own marriage was skidding slowly downhill, although he still loved Wendy and had promised sincerely and frequently to reform, for her sake and for baby Danny's. The 2 of them went on from many faculty parties, hitting the bars until they closed, then stopping at some mom-and-pop store for a case of beer that they'd drink, parked at the end of some back road. There were mornings when Jack would stumble into their leased house with dawn seeping into the sky and find Wendy and the baby asleep on the couch. Danny always on the inside, a tiny fist curled under the shelf of Wendy's jaw. He would look at them, and the self-loathing would back up his throat in a bitter wave, even stronger than the taste of beer and cigarettes and martinis. Martians, as Al called them. Those were the times that his mind would turn thoughtfully and sanely to the gun, or the rope, or the razor blade. If the bender had occurred on a weeknight, he would sleep for 3 hours, get up, dress, chew 4 Excedrins, and go off to teach his 9 o'clock American poets, still drunk. Good morning, kids. Today the Red-Eyed Wonder is going to tell you about how Longfellow lost his wife in a big fire. He hadn't believed he was an alcoholic. Jack thought as Al's telephone began ringing in his ear. The classes he had missed are taught unshaven, still reeking of last night's Martians. Not me, I can stop any time. The nights he and Wendy had passed in separate beds. Listen, I'm fine. Mashed fenders, sure, I'm okay to drive. The tears she always shed in the bathroom. Cautious looks from his colleagues at any party where alcohol was served, even wine. The slowly dawning realization that he was being talked about. The knowledge that he was producing nothing at his Underwood but balls of mostly blank paper that ended up in the wastebasket. He had been something of a catch for Stovington, a slowly blooming American writer perhaps, and certainly a man well qualified to teach that great mystery, creative writing. He had published 24 short stories. He was working on a play, and thought there might be a novel incubating in some mental back room. But now he was not producing, and his teaching had become erratic. It had finally ended one night less than a month after Jack had broken his son's arm. That, it seemed to him, had ended his marriage. All that remained was for Wendy to gather her will. If her mother hadn't been such a grade-A bitch, he knew. Wendy would have taken a bus back to New Hampshire as soon as Danny had been okay to travel. It was over. It had been a little past midnight. Jack and Al were coming into bar on US 31. Al behind the wheel of his Jag, shifting fancily on the curves, sometimes crossing the double yellow line. They were both very drunk. The Martians had landed that night in force. They came around the last curve before the bridge at 70, and there was a kid's bike in the road. And then the sharp hurt squealing as rubber shredded from the Jag's tires. And Jack remembered seeing Al's face looming over the steering wheel like a round white moon. Then the jingling, crashing sound as they hit the bike at 40, and it had flown up like a bent and twisted bird, the handlebars striking the windshield. And then it was in the air again, leaving the starred safety glass in front of Jack's bulging eyes. A moment later, he heard the final dreadful smash as it landed on the road behind them. Something thumped underneath them as the tires passed over it. The Jag drifted around broadside, Al still jockeying the wheel. And from far away, Jack heard himself saying, "Jesus, Al, we ran him down, I felt it." In his ear, the phone kept ringing. "Come on, Al, be home. Let me get this over with." Al had brought the car to a smoking halt, not more than 3 feet from a bridge stanchion. 2 of the Jag's tires were flat. They had left zigzagging loops of burned rubber for 130 feet. They looked at each other for a moment and then ran back to the cold darkness. The bike was completely ruined. 1 wheel was gone. And looking back over his shoulder, Al had seen it lying in the middle of the road, 6 spikes sticking up like piano wire. Al had said hesitantly, "I think that's what we ran over, Jackie boy." "Well, then where's the kid?" "Did you see a kid?" Jack frowned. It had all happened with such crazy speed. Coming around the corner, the bike looming in the Jag's headlights, Al yelling something. Then the collision and the long skid. They moved the bike to one shoulder of the road. Al went back to the Jag and put on its 4-way flashers. For the next 2 hours, they searched the sides of the road using a powerful 4-cell flashlight. Nothing. Although it was late, several cars passed the beached Jaguar and the 2 men with the bobbing flashlight. None of them stopped. Jack thought later that some queer providence, bent on giving them both a last chance, had kept the cops away. It kept any of the passersby from calling them. At 2:15, they returned to the Jag, sober but queasy.
If there's anybody riding it, what was it doing in the middle of the road?
Al demanded.
He wasn't parked on the side. It was right out in the fucking middle.
Jack could only shake his head.
Your party does not answer,
The operator said.
Would you like me to keep trying?
A couple more rings, operator, do you mind?
No, sir.
The voice said dutifully. Come on, Al. Al had hiked across the bridge to the nearest payphone, called a bachelor friend, and told him it would be worth $50 if the friend would get the Jag snow tires out of the garage and bring them down to Highway 31 bridge outside a bar. The friend showed up 20 minutes later, wearing a pair of jeans and his pajama top. He surveyed the scene.
Kill anybody?
Al was already jacking up the back of the car, and Jack was loosening lug nuts.
Providentially, no one,
Al said.
I think I'll just head on back anyway. Pay me in the morning.
Fine, Al said without looking up. The two of them had gotten the tires on without incident, and together they drove back to Al Shockley's house. Al put the Jag in the garage and killed the motor. In the dark quiet, he said,
I'm off drinking, Jackie boy. It's all over. I've slain my last Martian.
And now, sweating in this phone booth, it occurred to Jack that he had never doubted Al's ability to carry through. He had driven back to his own house in the VW with the radio turned up, and some disco group chanted over and over again, talismanic, in the house before dawn. Do it anyway. You want to do it any way you want. No matter how loud he heard the squealing tires, the crash. When he blinked his eyes shut, he saw that single crushed wheel with its broken spokes pointing at the sky. When he got in, Wendy was asleep on the couch. He looked in Danny's room, and Danny was in his crib on his back, sleeping deeply, his arm still buried in the cast. In the softly filtered glow from the streetlight outside, he could see the dark lines on his plastered whiteness, where all the doctors and the nurses and pediatrics had signed it. It was an accident. He fell down the stairs. Oh, you dirty liar. It was an accident. I lost my temper. You fucking drunken, wasted God wiped snot out of his nose, and that was you. Listen, hey, come on, please, just an accident. But the last plea was driven away by the image of that bobbing flashlight as they hunted through the dry, late November weeds, looking for the sprawled body that by all good rights should have been there, waiting for the police. It didn't matter that Al had been driving. There had been other nights when he had been driving. He pulled the covers up over Danny, went into their bedroom, and took the Spanish Llama 38 down from the top shelf of the closet. It was in a shoebox. He sat on the bed with it for nearly an hour, looking at it, fascinated by its deadly shine. It was dawn when he put it back in the box, and put the box back in the closet. That morning he had called Bruckner, the department head, and told him to please post his classes. He had the flu. Bruckner agreed, with less good grace than was common. Jack Torrance had been extremely susceptible to the flu in the last year. Wendy made him scrambled eggs and coffee. They ate in silence. The only sound came from the backyard, where Danny was gleefully running his trucks across the sand pile with his good hand. She went to do the dishes, her back to him. She said,
Jack, I've been thinking.
Have you? He lit a cigarette with trembling hands. No hangover this morning, oddly enough. Only the shakes. He blinked. In the instant's darkness, the bike flew up against the windshield, starring the glass. The tires shrieked. The flashlight bobbed.
I want to talk to you about what's best for me and Danny. For you too, maybe. I don't know. We should have talked about it before, I guess.
Would you do something for me? He asked, looking at the wavering tip of his cigarette. Would you do me a favor?
What?
Her voice was dull and neutral. He looked at her back. Let's talk about it a week from today, if you still want to. Now she turned to him, her hands lacy with suds, her pretty face pale and disillusioned.
Jack, promises don't work with you. You just go right on with...
She stopped, looking in his eyes, fascinated, suddenly uncertain. In a week, he said. His voice had lost all its strength and dropped to a whisper. Please. I'm not promising anything. If you still want to talk, then we'll talk. About anything you want. They looked across the sunny kitchen at each other for a long time. And when she turned back to the dishes, without saying anything more, he began to shudder. God, he needed a drink. Just a little pick-me-up to put things in their true perspective.
Danny said he dreamed you had a car accident, she said abruptly. He has funny dreams sometimes. He said it this morning, when I got him dressed. Did you, Jack? Did you have an accident?
No. By noon, the craving for a drink had become a low-grade fever. He went to Al's. You dry? Al asked before letting him in. Al looked horrible. Bone dry. He looked like Lon Chaney in Phantom of the Opera. Come on in. They played two-handed whist all afternoon. They did not drink. A week passed. He and Wendy didn't speak much, but he knew she was watching, not believing. He drank coffee black and endless cans of Coca-Cola. One night he drank a whole six-pack of Coke and then ran into the bathroom and vomited it up. The level of the bottles in the liquor cabinet did not go down. After his classes, he went over to Al Shockley's. She hated Al Shockley worse than she had ever hated anyone. And when he came home, she would swear she smelled scotch or gin on his breath. But he would talk lucidly to her before supper, drink coffee, play with Danny after supper, sharing a Coke with him, read him a bedtime story, then sit and correct themes with cup after cup of black coffee by his hand. And she would have to admit to herself that she had been wrong. Weeks passed, and the unspoken word retreated further from the back of their lips. Jack sensed its retirement, but knew it would never retire completely. Things began to get a little easier. Then George Hatfield. He had lost his temper again. This time stone sober.
Sir, your party doesn't...
Hello? Al's voice out of breath.
Go ahead,
The operator said dourly. Al, this is Jack Torrance.
Jackie boy,
Genuine pleasure.
how are you?
Good. I just called to say thanks. I got the job. It's perfect. If I can't finish that goddamn play, snowed in all winter, I'll never finish it.
You'll finish.
How are things? Jack asked hesitantly.
Dry.
Al responded.
You?
As a bone.
Miss it much?
Every day. Al laughed.
I know that scene, but I don't know how you stayed dry after that Hatfield thing, Jack. That was above and beyond.
I really bitch things up for myself, he said evenly. Oh, hell, I'll have the board around by spring. He's already saying they might have been too hasty. And if that play comes to something...
Yeah, listen. My boys,
Yes, listen, my boy's out in the car, Al. He looks like he might be getting restless.
Sure, understand. You have a good winter up there, Jack. Glad to help.
Thanks again, Al. He hung up, closed his eyes in the hot booth, and again saw the crashing bike, the bobbing flashlight. There had been a squib in the paper the next day, no more than a space filler, really, but the owner had not been named. Why it had been out there in the night would always be a mystery to them, and perhaps that was as it should be. He went back to the car and gave Danny a slightly melted Baby Ruth.
Daddy?
What, Doc? Danny hesitated, looking at his father's abstracted face.
When I was waiting for you to come back from that hotel, I had a bad dream. Do you remember when I fell asleep?
Mm-hmm. But it was no good. Daddy's mind was someplace else, not with him. Thinking about the bad thing again.
I dreamed that you hurt me, Daddy.
What was the dream, Doc?
Nothing.
Danny said as they pulled out into the parking lot. He put the maps back into the glove compartment. You sure?
Yes.
Jack gave his son a faint, troubled glance, and then his mind turned to his play. Chapter 6. Night Thoughts. Love was over, and her man was sleeping beside her. Her man. She smiled a little in the darkness. His seed was still trickling with slow warmth from between her slightly parted thighs, and her smile was both rueful and pleased, because the phrase, her man, summoned up 100 different feelings. Each feeling, examined alone, was a bewilderment. Together, in this darkness floating to sleep, they were like distant blues tune heard in an almost deserted nightclub, melancholy but pleasing. Loving you, baby, is just like rolling off a log. If I can't be your woman, I sure ain't gonna be your dog. Had that been Billie Holiday? Or someone more prosaic like Peggy Lee? Didn't matter. It was low and torchy, and in the silence of her head it played mellowly, as if issuing from one of those old-fashioned jukeboxes, a Wurlitzer perhaps, half an hour before closing. Now, moving away from her consciousness, she wondered how many beds she had slept in with this man beside her. They had met in college, and had first made love in his apartment. It had been less than 3 months after her mother drove her from the house, told her to never come back. If she wanted to go somewhere, she could go to her father, since she had been responsible for the divorce. That had been in 1970. So long ago. A semester later, they had moved in together, had found jobs for the summer, and had kept the apartment when their senior year began. She remembered that bed the most clearly, a big double that sagged in the middle. When they made love, the rusty box spring had counted the beats. That fall, she had finally managed to break from her mother. Jack had helped her. She wants to keep beating you, Jack had said. The more times you phone her, the more times you crawl back begging forgiveness, the more she can beat you with her father. It's good for her. It's good for her, Wendy, because she can go on making believe it was your fault. It's not good for you. They had talked it over again and again in that bed that year. And Jack sitting up with the covers pulled around his waist, cigarette burning between his fingers, looking her in the eye. He had a half-humorous, half-scowling way of doing that, telling her, "She told you to never come back, right? Never to darken her door again, right? Then why does she hang up the phone when she knows it's you? Why does she only tell you that you can't come in if I'm with you? Because she thinks I might cramp her style a little bit. She wants to keep putting the thumb screws right to you, baby. You're a fool if you keep letting her do it. She told you never come back, so why don't you take her at her word, give it a rest?" And at last, she'd seen it his way. It had been Jack's idea to separate for a while, to get perspective on the relationship, he said. She had been afraid he had become interested in someone else. Later, she found it wasn't so. They were together again in the spring, and he asked her if she had been to see her father. She had jumped as if he'd struck her with a quirt. "How did you know that?" "The shadow knows." "Have you been spying on me?" And his impatient laughter, which had always made her feel so awkward, as if she were 8, and he was able to see her motivations more clearly than she. "You needed time, Wendy." "For what?" "I guess to see which one of us you wanted to marry." "Jack, what are you saying?" "I think I'm proposing marriage." The wedding. Her father had been there, her mother had not been. She discovered she could live with that, if she had Jack. Then Danny had come, her fine son. That had been the best year, the best bed. After Danny was born, Jack had gotten her a job typing for half a dozen English department profs. Quizzes, exams, class syllabi, study notes, reading lists. She ended up typing a novel for one of them, a novel that never got published, much to Jack's very irreverent and very private glee. The job was good for 40 a week, skyrocketed all the way up to 60 during the 2 months she spent typing the unsuccessful novel. They had their first car, a 5-year-old Buick with a baby seat in the middle. Bright, upwardly mobile, young marrieds. Danny forced a reconciliation between her and her mother. A reconciliation that was always tense and never happy, but a reconciliation all the same. When she took Danny to the house, she went without Jack. She didn't tell Jack that her mother had always remade Danny's diapers, frowned over his formula, could always spot the accusatory first signs of a rash on the baby's bottom or privates. Her mother never said anything overtly, but the message came through anyway. The price she had begun to pay, and maybe always would, for the reconciliation was the feeling that she was an inadequate mother. It was her mother's way of keeping the thumbscrews handy. During the days Wendy would stay home and housewife, feeding Danny his bottles in the sun-washed kitchen of the 4-room second-story apartment, playing her records on the battered portable stereo she had had since high school. Jack would come home at 3 or at 2 if he felt he could cut his last class, and while Danny slept, he would lead her into the bedroom and fears of inadequacy would be erased. At night while she typed, he would do his writing and his assignments. In those days, She sometimes came out of the bedroom, where the typewriter was, to find both of them asleep on the studio couch. Jack wearing nothing but his underpants. Danny sprawled comfortably on her husband's chest with his thumb in his mouth. She would put Danny in his crib, then read whatever Jack had written that night before waking him up enough to come to bed. Bed. The best year. Sun gonna shine in my backyard someday. In those days, his drinking had still been well in hand. On Saturday nights, a bunch of his fellow students would drop over, and there would be a case of beer and discussions in which she would seldom take part because her field had been sociology and his was English. Arguments over whether Pepys' diaries were literature or history. Discussions of Charles Olson's poetry, sometimes the reading of works in progress, those and 100 others, no 1,000. She felt no real urge to take part. It was enough to sit in her rocking chair beside Jack, who sat cross-legged on the floor, one hand holding a beer, the other gently cupping her calf or braceleting her ankle. The competition at UNH had been fierce, and Jack carried an extra burden in his writing. He put in at least an hour at it every night. It was his routine. The Saturday sessions were necessary therapy. They let something out of him that might otherwise have swelled and swelled until he burst. At the end of his grad work, he had landed the job at Stovington, mostly on the strength of his stories, 4 of them published at that time, one of them in Esquire. She remembered that day clearly enough. It would take more than 3 years to forget it. She had almost thrown the envelope away, thinking it was a prescription or subscription offer. Opening it, she had found instead that it was a letter saying that Esquire would like to use Jack's story concerning the black holes early the following year. They would pay $900, not on publication, but on acceptance. That was nearly a half a year's take typing papers, and she had flown to the telephone, leaving Danny in his high chair to goggle comically after his face lathered with creamed peas and beef puree. Jack had arrived from the university 45 minutes later. The Buick weighted down with 7 friends and a keg of beer. After a ceremonial toast, Wendy also had a glass, although she ordinarily had no taste for beer. Jack had signed the acceptance letter, put it in the return envelope, and went down the block to drop it in the letterbox. When he came back, he stood gravely in the door and said, "Vini Vidi Vici." There were cheers and applause. When the keg was empty at 11 that night, Jack and the only 2 others who were still ambulatory went on to hit a few bars. She had gotten him inside in the downstairs hallway. The other 2 were already out in the car, drunkenly singing the New Hampshire fight song. Jack was down on one knee, owlishly fumbling with the lacings of his moccasins.
"Jack," she said, "you shouldn't. You can't even tie your shoes, let alone drive."
He stood up and put his hands calmly on her shoulders. "Tonight I could fly to the moon if I wanted to."
"No," she said. "Not for all the Esquire stories in the world."
"I'll be home early." But he hadn't been home until 4 in the morning, stumbling and mumbling his way up the stairs, waking Danny up when he came in. He had tried to soothe the baby and drop him down on the floor. Wendy had rushed out, thinking of what her mother would think if she saw the bruise before she thought of anything else. God help her, God help them both. And then picked Danny up, sat in the rocking chair with him, soothed him. She had been thinking of her mother for most of the 5 hours Jack had been gone. Her mother's prophecy that Jack would never come to anything. Big ideas, her mother had said. Sure, the welfare lines are full of educated fools with big ideas. Did the Esquire story make her mother right or wrong? Winifred, you're not holding that baby right. Give him to me. And was she not holding her husband right? Why else Would he take his joy out of the house? A helpless kind of terror had risen up in her, and it never occurred to her that he had gone out for reasons that had nothing to do with her.
Congratulations,
She said, rocking Danny. He was almost asleep again.
maybe you gave him a concussion.
It's just a bruise. He sounded sulky, wanting to be repentant. A little boy. For an instant, she hated him.
Maybe,
She said tightly.
maybe not.
She heard so much of her mother talking to her departed father in her own voice that she was sickened and afraid. Like mother, like daughter, Jack muttered.
Go to bed,
She cried, her fear coming out sounding like anger.
go to bed, you're drunk.
Don't tell me what to do.
Jack, please, we shouldn't.
There were no words. Don't tell me what to do, he repeated sullenly, and then went into the bedroom. She was left alone in the rocking chair with Danny, who was sleeping again. 5 minutes later, Jack's snores came floating out of into the living room. That had been the first night she had slept on the couch. Now she turned restlessly on the bed, already dozing. Her mind, freed of any linear order by encroaching sleep, floated past the first year at Stovington, past the steadily worsening times that had reached low ebb when her husband had broken Danny's arm, to that morning in the breakfast nook. Danny outside playing trucks in the sand pile, his arm still in the cast. Jack sitting at the table, pallid and grizzled, a cigarette jittering between his fingers. She had decided to ask him for divorce. She had pondered the question from 100 different angles. Had been pondering it, in fact, for the 6 months before the broken arm. She told herself she would have made the decision long ago if it hadn't been for Danny. But not even that was necessarily true. She dreamed on the long nights when Jack was out, and her dreams were always of her mother's face and of her own wedding. Who giveth this woman? Her father is standing in his best suit, which was none too good. He was a traveling salesman for a line of canned goods that even then was going broke. And his tired face, how old did he look? How pale. I do. Even after the accident, if you could call it an accident, she had not been able to bring it all the way out, to admit that her marriage was a lopsided defeat. She had waited, dumbly hoping that a miracle would occur, and Jack would see what was happening, not only to him, but to her. But there had been no slowdown. A drink before going off to the academy, 2 or 3 beers with lunch at the Stovington house, 3 or 4 martinis before dinner, 5 or 6 more while grading papers. The weekends were worse. The nights out with Al Shockley were worse still. She had never dreamed there could be so much pain in a life when there was nothing physically wrong. She heard all the time. How much of it was her fault? That question haunted her. She felt like her mother, like her father. Sometimes when she felt like herself, she wondered what it would be like for Danny. And she dreaded the day when he grew old enough to lay blame. And she wondered where they would go. She had no doubt her mother would take her in. And no doubt that after half a year of watching her diapers remade, Danny's meals recooked and or redistributed, of coming home to find his clothes changed or his hair cut or the books her mother found unsuitable spirited away to some limbo in the attic. After half a year of that, she would have a complete nervous breakdown. And her mother would pat her hand and say comfortingly, "Although it's not your fault, it's all your own fault. You were never ready. You showed your true colors when you came between your father and me." My father, Danny's father, mine, his. Who giveth this woman?
I do.
Dead of a heart attack 6 months later. The night before that morning, she had lain awake almost until he came in, thinking, coming to her decision. The divorce was necessary, she told herself. Her mother and father didn't belong in the decision. Neither did her feelings of guilt over her marriage, nor her feelings of inadequacy over her own. It was necessary for her son's sake and for herself, if she was to salvage anything at all from her early adulthood. The handwriting on the wall was brutal but clear. Her husband was a lush. He had a bad temper, one he could no longer keep wholly under control now that he was drinking so heavily and his riding was going so badly. Accidentally or not accidentally, he had broken Danny's arm. He was going to lose his job, if not this year, then the year after. Already she had noticed the sympathetic looks from the other faculty wives. She told herself that she had stuck with the messy job of her marriage for as long as she could. Now she would have to leave it. Jack could have full visitation rights, and she would want support from him only until she could find something and get on her feet, and that would have to be fairly rapidly because she didn't know how long Jack would be able to pay support money. She would do it with as little bitterness as possible, but it had to end. So thinking, she had fallen off into her own thin and unrestful sleep, haunted by the faces of her own mother and father. "You're nothing but a home wrecker," her mother said. "Who giveth this woman?" the minister said. "I do," her father said. But in the bright and sunny morning she felt the same. Her back to him, her hands plunged in warm dishwater up to the wrists, she had commenced with the unpleasantness.
"I want to talk to you about something that might be best for Danny and I. For you too, maybe. We should have talked about it before, I guess." And then he had said an odd thing. She had expected to discover his anger, to provoke the bitterness, the recriminations. She had expected a mad dash for the liquor cabinet. But not this soft, almost toneless reply that was so unlike him. It was almost as though the Jack she had lived with for 6 years had never come back last night, as if he had been replaced by some unearthly doppelganger that she would never know or be quite sure of. "Would you do something for me? A favor?" "What?"
She had to discipline her voice strictly to keep it from trembling. "Let's talk about it in a week, if you still want to." And she had agreed. It remained unspoken between them. During that week he had seen Al Shockley more than ever, but he came home early, and there was no liquor on his breath. She imagined she smelt it, but knew it wasn't so. Another week, and another. Divorce went back to committee, unvoted on. What had happened? She still wondered and still had not the slightest idea. The subject was taboo between them. He was like a man who had leaned around a corner and had seen an unexpected monster lying in wait, crouching among the dried bones of its old kills. The liquor remained in the cabinet, but he didn't touch it. She had considered throwing them out a dozen times, but in the end always backed away from the idea, as if some unknown charm would be broken by the act. And there was Danny's part in it to consider. If she felt she didn't know her husband, then she was in awe of her child. Awe in the strict meaning of that word, a kind of undefined, superstitious dread. Dozing lightly, the image of the instant of his birth was presented to her. She was again lying on the delivery table, bathed in sweat, her hair in strings, her feet splayed out in the stirrups, and a little high from the gas they kept giving her whiffs of. At one point, she had muttered that she felt like an advertisement for gang rape, And the nurse, an old bird who had assisted at the births of enough children to populate a high school, found that extremely funny. The doctor between her legs, the nurse off to one side, arranging instruments and humming. The sharp, glassy pains had been coming at steadily shortening intervals, and several times she had screamed in spite of her shame. Then the doctor told her to quite sternly that she must push, and she did. And then she felt something being taken from her. It was a clear and distinct feeling, one she would never forget. The thing taken. Then the doctor held her son up by the legs. She had seen his tiny sex and known he was a boy immediately. And as the doctor groped for the air mask, she had been something else. She had seen something else, something so horrible that she found the strength to scream again after she had thought all screams were used up. He has no face. But of course, there had been a face, Danny's own sweet face, and the caul that had covered it at birth now resided in a small jar which she had kept, almost shamefully. She did not hold with old superstition, but she had kept the caul nevertheless. She did not hold with wives' tales, but the boy had been unusual from the first. She did not believe in second sight, but did Daddy have an accident? I dreamed Daddy had an accident. Something had changed him. She didn't believe it was just her getting ready to ask for a divorce that had done it. Something had happened before that morning. Something that had happened while she slept uneasily. Al Shockley said that nothing had happened, nothing at all. But he had averted his eyes when he said it. And if you believe faculty gossip, Al had also climbed aboard the fabled wagon. Did Daddy have an accident? Maybe a chance collision with fate. Surely nothing much more concrete. She had read that day's paper and the next day's with a closer eye than usual. She saw nothing that she could connect with Jack. God help her. She had been looking for a hit-and-run accident or a barroom brawl that had resulted in serious injuries, or who knew? Who wanted to? But no policeman came to call, either ask questions or with a warrant empowering him to take paint scrapings from the VW's bumpers. Nothing. Only her husband's 180-degree change and her son's sleepy question on waking. Did Daddy have an accident? I dreamed. She had stuck with Jack more for Danny's sake than she would admit in her waking hours, but now, sleeping lightly, she could admit it. Danny had been Jack's for the asking, almost from the first, just as she had been her father's, almost from the first. She couldn't remember Danny ever spitting a bottle back on Jack's shirt. Jack could get him to eat after she had given up in disgust, even when Danny was teething, and it gave him visible pain to chew. When Danny had a stomach ache, she would rock him for an hour before he began to quiet. Jack had only to pick him up, walk twice around the room with him, and Danny would be asleep on Jack's shoulder, his thumb securely corked in his mouth. He hadn't minded changing diapers, even those he called the special deliveries. He sat with Danny for hours on end, bouncing him on his lap, playing finger games with him, making faces at him, while Danny poked at his nose and then collapsed with the giggles. He made formulas and administered them faultlessly, getting up every last burp afterward. He would take Danny with him in the car to get paper or a bottle of milk or nails at the hardware store, even when their son was still an infant. He had taken Danny to a Stovington Keene soccer match when Danny was only 6 months old, and Danny had sat motionlessly on his father's lap throughout the whole game, wrapped in a blanket, a small Stovington pennant clutched in one chubby fist. He loved his mother, but he was his father's boy. And hadn't she felt, time and time again, her son's wordless opposition to the whole idea of divorce. She would be thinking about it in the kitchen, turning it over in her mind as she turned the potatoes for supper over in her hands for the peeler's blade. And she would turn around to see him sitting cross-legged in a kitchen chair, looking at her with eyes that seemed both frightened and accusatory. Walking with him in the park, he would suddenly seize both her hands and say, almost demand, "Do you love me? Do you love me, Daddy?" And confused, she would nod or say, "Of course I do, honey." Then he would run to the duck pond, sending them squawking and scared to the other end, flapping their wings in a panic before the small ferocity of his charge, leaving her to stare after him and wonder. There were even times when it seemed that her determination, or at least discuss the matter with Jack, dissolved, not out of her own weakness, but under the determination of her son's will. I don't believe such things. But in his sleep, she did believe them, and in sleep, with her husband's seed still drying on her thighs, she felt that the three of them had been permanently welded together, that if their oneness was to be destroyed, it would not be destroyed by any of them, but from outside. Most of what she believed centered around her love for Jack. She had never stopped loving him, except maybe for that dark period immediately following Danny's accident. And she loved her son. Most of all, she loved them together, walking or riding or only sitting, Jack's large head and Danny's small one poised alertly over the fans of old-made hands, sharing a bottle of Coke, looking at the funnies. She loved having them with her, and she hoped to dear God that this hotel caretaking job Al had gotten for Jack would be the beginning of good times again. And the wind gonna rise up, baby, and blow my blues away. Soft and sweet and mellow, the song came back and lingered, following her down into a deeper sleep, where thoughts ceased, and the faces that came in dreams went unremembered. Chapter 7. In another bedroom. Danny awoke with the booming still loud in his ears, and the drunk, savagely pettish voice crying hoarsely, "Come out here and take your medicine. I'll find you. I'll find you." But now the booming was only his racing heart, and the only voice in the night was the faraway sound of a police siren. He lay in bed motionlessly, looking up at the wind-stirred shadows of the leaves on his bedroom ceiling. They twined sinuously together, making shapes like the vines and creepers in a jungle, like patterns woven into the nap of a thick carpet. He was clad in Dr. Denton pajamas, but between the pajama suit and his skin, he had grown a more closely fitting singlet of perspiration. "Tony," he whispered, "you there?" No answer. He slipped out of bed and padded silently across to the window and looked out on Arapahoe Street, now still and silent. It was 2 a.m. There was nothing out there but empty sidewalks, drifted with fallen leaves, parked cars, and the long-necked street light on the corner across from the Cliff Bryce gas station. With its hooded top and motionless stance, the street light looked like a monster in a space show. He looked up the street both ways, straining his eyes for Tony's slight, beckoning form. But there was no one there. The wind sighed through the trees. The fallen leaves rattled up the deserted walks and around the hubcaps of parked cars. It was a faint and sorrowful sound, and the boy thought that he might be the only one in Boulder awake enough to hear it. The only human being, at least. There was no way of knowing what else might be out in the night, slinking hungrily through the shadows, watching and scenting the breeze. I'll find you. I'll find you.
Tony,
he whispered again, but without much hope. Only the wind spoke back, gusting more strongly this time, scattering leaves across the sloping roof below his window. Some of them slipped into the rain gutter and came to rest there like tired dancers. Danny. Danny. He started at the sound of that familiar voice and craned out the window, his small hands on the sill. With the sound of Tony's voice, the whole night seemed to have come silently and secretly alive, whispering even when the wind quieted again and the leaves were still and the shadows had stopped moving. He thought he saw a darker shadow standing by the bus stop a block down, but it was hard to tell if it was a real thing or an eye trick. Don't go, Danny. Then the wind gusted again, making him squint, and the shadow by the bus stop was gone. If it had ever been there at all. He stood by his window for a minute, an hour, sometime longer. But there was no more. At last, he crept back into his bed, pulled the blankets up, and watched the shadows thrown by the alien streetlight turn into a sinuous jungle filled with flesh-eating plants that wanted only to slip around him, squeeze the life out of him, and drag him down into a blackness where one sinister word flashed in red. Red rum. Part 2. Closing Day. Chapter 8. A View of the Overlook. Mommy was worried. She was afraid the bug wouldn't make it up and down all these mountains, and that they would get stranded by the side of the road where somebody might come ripping along and hit them. Danny himself was more sanguine. If Daddy thought the bug would make this one last trip, then probably it would. We're just about there, Jack said. Wendy brushed her hair back from her temples. Thank God. She was sitting in the right-hand bucket, Victoria Holt paperback open but face down in her lap. She was wearing her blue dress, the one Danny thought was her prettiest. It had a sailor collar. It made her look very young, like a girl just getting ready to graduate from high school. Daddy kept putting his hand high up on her leg, and she kept laughing and brushing it off, saying, "Get away, fly." Danny was impressed with the mountains. One day, Daddy had taken them up in the ones near Boulder, the ones they called the Flatirons. But these were much bigger, and on the tallest of them, you could see a fine dusting of snow, which Daddy said was often there year-round. And they were actually in the mountains, no goofing around. Sheer rock faces rose all around them, so high you could barely see their tops, even by craning your neck out the window. When they left Boulder, the temperature had been in the high 70s. Now, just after noon, the air up here felt crisp and cold like November back in Vermont. And Daddy had the heater going. Not that it worked all that well. They had passed several signs that said, "Falling Rock Zone." Mommy read each one to him. And although Danny had waited anxiously to see some rock fall, none had. At least not yet. Half an hour ago, they had passed another sign that Daddy said was very important. This sign said, "Entering Sidewinder Pass." And Daddy said that sign was as far as the snowplows went in the wintertime. After that, the road got too steep. In the winter, the road was closed from the little town of Sidewinder, which they had gone through just before they got to that sign, all the way to Buckland, Utah. Now they were passing another sign.
What's that one, Mom? That one says, "Slower vehicles use right lane." That means us. "The bug'll make it," Danny said. "Please, God," Mommy said and crossed her fingers. Danny looked down at her open-toed sandals and saw that she had crossed her toes as well. He giggled. She smiled back, but he knew that she was still worried. The road wound up and up in a series of slow S-curves, and Jack dropped the bug stick shift from 4th gear to 3rd, and then into 2nd. The bug wheezed and protested, and Wendy's eye fixed on the speedometer needle, which sank from 40 to 30 to 20, where it hovered reluctantly. "The fuel pump," she began timidly. "The fuel pump will go another 3 miles, Jack said shortly. The rock wall fell away on their right, disclosing a slash valley that seemed to go down forever, lined a dark green with Rocky Mountain pine and spruce. The pines fell away to gray cliffs of rock that dropped for hundreds of feet before smoothing out. She saw a waterfall spilling over one of them, the early afternoon sun sparkling in it like a golden fish snared in a blue net. They were beautiful mountains, but they were hard. She did not think they would forgive many mistakes. An unhappy foreboding rose in their throat. Further west in the Sierra Nevada, the Donner Party had become snowbound and had resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. The mountains did not forgive many mistakes. With a punch of the clutch and a jerk, Jack shifted down to 1st gear and they labored upward, the bug's engine thumping gamely. "You know," she said, "I don't think we've seen 5 cars since we came through Sidewinder. And one of them was a hotel limousine."
Jack nodded. It goes right to Stapleton Airport in Denver. There's already some icy patches up beyond the hotel, Watson says, and they're forecasting more snow for tomorrow up higher. Anybody going through the mountains now wants to be on one of the main roads just in case. That goddamn Ullman better still be up there. I guess he will be.
"You're sure the larder's fully stocked?" she asked, still thinking of the Donners.
He said so. He wanted Halloran to go over it with you. Halloran's the cook.
"Oh,"
she said faintly, looking at the speedometer. It had dropped from 15 to 10 miles an hour. There's the top. Jack said, pointing 300 yards ahead. "There's a scenic turnout, and you can see the overlook from there. I'm going to pull off the road and give the bug a chance to rest." He craned over his shoulder at Danny, who was sitting on a pile of blankets. "What do you think, Doc? Might see some deer. Or caribou."
Sure, Dad.
The VW labored up and up. The speedometer dropped just above the 5-mile-an-hour hash mark and was beginning to hitch when Jack pulled off the road.
What's that sign, Mommy? Scenic turnout, she read dutifully,
and stepped on the emergency brake and let the VW run in neutral. "Come on," he said, and got out. They walked to the guardrail together. "That's it." "That's it," Jack said, and pointed at 11 o'clock. For Wendy, it was discovering truth in a cliché. Her breath was taken away for a moment. She was unable to breathe at all. The view had knocked the wind from her. They were standing nearer the top of one peak. Across from them, who knew how far, an even taller mountain reared into the sky, its jagged tip only a silhouette that was now nimbused by the sun, which was beginning its decline. The whole valley floor was spread out below them, the slopes that they had climbed, and the laboring bug falling away with such dizzying suddenness that she knew to look down there for too long would bring on nausea and eventually vomiting. The imagination seemed to spring to full life in the clear air, beyond the reign of reason, and to look was to helplessly see oneself plunging down and down and down. Sky and slopes changing places in slow cartwheels, the scream drifting from your mouth like a lazy balloon as your hair and your dress billowed out. She jerked her gaze away from the drop, almost by force, and followed Jack's finger. She could see the highway clinging to the side of this cathedral spire, switching itself back on itself, but always tending northwest, still climbing, but at a more gentle angle. Farther up, seeming set directly into the slope itself, she saw the grimly clinging pines give way to a wide square of green lawn, and standing in the middle of it, overlooking all this, the hotel. The overlook. Seeing it, she found breath and voice again.
"Oh, Jack, it's gorgeous."
"Yes, it is," he said. "Ullman says he thinks it's the single most beautiful location in America. I don't care much for him, but I think he might be. Danny, are you all right?" She looked around for him, and her sudden fear for him blotted out everything else, stupendous or not. She darted toward him. He was holding onto the guardrail and looking up at the hotel, his face a pasty gray color. His eyes had the blank look of someone on the verge of fainting. She knelt beside him and put steadying hands on his shoulder.
"Danny, what's..."
Jack was beside her. "You okay, Doc?" He gave Danny a brisk little shake, and his eyes cleared.
"I'm okay, Daddy, I'm fine." "What was it, Danny?" she asked. "Were you dizzy, honey?" "No, I was just thinking. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you."
He looked at his parents kneeling in front of him and offered them a small puzzled smile.
Maybe it was the sun. The sun got in my eyes." "Well, we'll get you up to the hotel and give you a drink of water." "Okay."
And then the bug, which moved upward much more surely on the gentler grade, he kept looking out between them as the road unwound, affording occasional glimpses of the Overlook Hotel, its massive bank of westward-looking windows reflecting back the sun. It was the place he had seen in the midst of the blizzard, the dark and booming place where some hideously familiar figure sought him down the long corridors carpeted with jungle, the place Tony had warned him against. It was here. It was here. Whatever red rum was, it was here. Chapter 9. Checking it out. Ullman was waiting for them just inside the wide, old-fashioned front doors. He shook hands with Jack and nodded coolly at Wendy, perhaps noticing the way heads turned when she came through into the lobby, her golden hair spilling across the shoulders of the simple navy dress. The hem of the dress stopped a modest 2 inches above the knee, but you didn't have to see more to know they were good legs. Ullman seemed truly warm toward Danny only, but Wendy had experienced that before. Danny seemed to be a child for people who ordinarily held W.C. Field's sentiments about children. He bent a little from the waist and offered Danny his hand. Danny shook it formally without a smile. "My son, Danny," Jack said, "and my wife, Winifred."
I'm happy to meet you both, Ullman said. How old are you, Danny? 5, sir. Sir yet? Ullman smiled and glanced at Jack. He's well-mannered.
"Of course he is," Jack said.
And Mrs. Torrance. He offered the same little bow, and for a bemused instant, Wendy thought he would kiss her hand. She half offered it, and he did take it, but only for a moment, clasped in both of his. His hands were small and dry and smooth, and she guessed that he powdered them. The lobby was a bustle of activity. Almost every one of the old-fashioned high-backed chairs was taken. Bellboys shuttled in and out with suitcases, and there was a line at the desk, which was dominated by a huge brass cash register. The Bank AmeriCard and MasterCharge decals on it seemed jarringly anachronistic. To their right, down toward a pair of tall double doors that were pulled closed and roped off, there was an old-fashioned fireplace now blazing with birch logs. 3 nuns sat on a sofa that was drawn up almost to the hearth itself. They were talking and smiling with their bags stacked up to either side, waiting for the checkout line to thin a little. As Wendy watched them, they burst into a chord of tinkling girlish laughter. She felt a smile touch her own lips. Not one of them could be under 60. In the background was a constant hum of conversation, the muted ding of the silver-plated bell beside the cash register as one of the 2 clerks on duty struck it, the slightly impatient call of "Front, please." It brought back strong, warm memories of her honeymoon in New York with Jack at the Beekman Tower. For the first time, she let herself believe that this might be exactly what the 3 of them needed, a season together away from the world, a sort of family honeymoon. She smiled affectionately down at Danny, who was goggling around frankly at everything. Another limo, as gray as a banker's vest, had pulled up out front. The last day of the season, Ullman was saying. Closing day. Always hectic. I had expected you more around 3, Mr. Torrance.
I wanted to give the folks time for a nervous breakdown if it decided to have one, Jack said. It didn't.
How fortunate, Ullman said. I'd like to take the 3 of you on a tour of the place a little later, and of course Dick Halloran wants to show Mrs. Torrance the Overlook's kitchen. But I'm afraid... One of the clerks came over and almost tugged his forelock.
"Excuse me, Mr. Ullman."
Well, what is it?
"It's Mrs. Brandt."
The clerk said uncomfortably.
She refuses to pay her bill with anything but her American Express card. I told her we stopped taking American Express at the end of the season last year, but she won't. His eyes shifted to the Torrance family, then back to Ullman. He shrugged. I'll take care of it. Thank you, Mr. Ullman. The clerk crossed back to the desk, where a dreadnought of a woman bundled into a long fur coat and what looked like a black feather boa was remonstrating loudly. I have been coming to the Overlook Hotel since 1955, she was telling the smiling, shrugging clerk. I continued to come even after my second husband died of a stroke on that tiresome Rook Court. I told him the sun was too hot that day, and I have never, I repeat, never paid with anything but my American Express card. Call the police if you like. Have them drag me away. I will still refuse to pay with anything but my American Express credit card. I repeat. Excuse me, Mr. Ullman said. They watched him cross the lobby, touch Mrs. Brandt's elbow deferentially, and spread his hands and nod when she turned her tirade on him. He listened sympathetically, nodded again, and said something in return. Mrs. Brandt smiled triumphantly, turned to the unhappy desk clerk, and said loudly, Thank God there's one employee of this hotel who hasn't become an utter Philistine! She allowed Ullman, who barely came to the bulky shoulder of her fur coat, to take her arm and lead her away, presumably to his inner office. Whew, Wendy said, smiling. There's a dude who earns his money. But he didn't like that lady, Danny said immediately. He was just pretending to like her. Jack grinned down at him. I'm sure that's true, Doc, but flattery is the stuff that greases the wheels of the world. What's flattery? Flattery, Wendy told him, is when your daddy says he likes my new yellow slacks, even if he doesn't, or when he says I don't need to take off 5 pounds. Oh, is it lying for fun? Something very like that. He had been looking at her closely and now said, You're pretty, Mommy. He frowned in confusion when they exchanged a glance and then burst into laughter. Ullman didn't waste much flattery on me, Jack said. Come on over by the window, you guys. I feel conspicuous standing out here in the middle with my denim jacket on. I honest to God didn't think there'd be anybody much here on closing day. I guess I was wrong. Oh, you look very handsome, she said, and then they laughed again, Wendy putting a hand over her mouth. Danny still didn't understand, but it was okay. They were loving each other. Danny thought this place reminded her of somewhere else. The Beakman place. Where she had been happy. He wished he liked it as well as she did, but he kept telling himself over and over that those things that Tony showed him didn't always come true. He would be careful. He would watch for something called red rum. But he would not say anything unless he absolutely had to, because they were happy. They had been laughing, and there were no bad thoughts. Look at this view, Jack said. Oh, it's gorgeous. Danny, look. But Danny didn't think it was particularly gorgeous. He didn't like heights. They made him dizzy. Beyond the wide front porch, which ran the length of the hotel, a beautifully manicured lawn, there was a putting green on the right, sloped away to a long rectangular swimming pool. A closed sign stood on a little tripod at one end of the pool. Closed was one sign he could read by himself, along with stop, exit, pizza, and a few others. Beyond the pool, a graveled path wound off through baby pines and spruces and aspens. Here was a small sign he didn't know. ROQUE.
There was an arrow below it. What's ROQUE, Daddy? Game, Daddy said. It's a little bit like croquet, only you play it on a gravel court that has sides like a big billiard table instead of grass. It's a very old game, Danny. Sometimes they have tournaments here. Do you play it with a croquet mallet? Like that, Jack agreed. Only the handle's a little shorter, and the head has two sides. One side's hard rubber and the other side is wood. Come out, you little shit. It's pronounced roke, Daddy was saying. I'll teach you how to play if you want. Maybe, Danny said in an odd, colorless little voice that made his parents exchange a puzzled look over his head. I might not like it, though. Well, if you don't like it, Doc, you don't have to play. All right? Sure. Do you like the animals? Wendy asked. That's called a topiary. Beyond the path leading to Roke, there were hedges clipped into the shapes of various animals. Danny, whose eyes were sharp, made out a rabbit, a dog, a horse, a cow, and a trio of bigger ones that looked like frolicking lions. Those animals were what made Uncle Al think of me for the job, Jack told him. He knew that when I was in college, I used to work for a landscaping company. That's a business that fixes people's lawns and bushes and hedges. I used to trim a lady's topiary, just like that. Wendy put a hand over her mouth and snickered. Looking at her, Jack said, Yes, I used to trim her topiary at least once a week. Get away, Fly, Wendy said, and snickered again. Did she have nice hedges, Dad? Danny asked, and at this they both stifled great bursts of laughter. Wendy laughed so hard that tears streamed down her cheeks, and she had to get a Kleenex out of her handbag. Oh, they weren't animals, Danny, Jack said when he had control of himself. They were playing cards. Spades and hearts and clubs and diamonds. But the hedges grow, you see. They creep, Watson had said. No, not the hedges, the boiler. You have to watch it all the time or you and your family will end up in the fucking moon. They looked at him, puzzled. The smile had faded off his face. Dad? Danny asked. He blinked at them, as if coming back from far away. Well, they grow, Danny, and lose their shape. So I'll have to give them a haircut once or twice a week until it gets so cold that they stop growing for the year. And a playground, too, Wendy said. My lucky boy. The playground was beyond the topiary. 2 slides, a big swing set with a half a dozen swings set at varying heights, a jungle gym, a tunnel made of cement rings, a sandbox, and a playhouse that was an exact replica of the overlook itself. Do you like it, Danny? Wendy asked. I sure do, he said, hoping he sounded more enthused than he felt. It's neat. Beyond the playground, there was an inconspicuous chain-link security fence. Beyond that, the wide macadamized drive that led up to the hotel, and beyond that, the valley itself, dropping away into the bright blue haze of afternoon. Danny didn't know the word macadamized. Danny didn't know the word isolation, but if someone had explained it to him, he would have seized on it. Far below, lying in the sun like a long black snake that had decided to snooze for a while, was the road that led back through Sidewinder Pass and eventually to Boulder. The road that would be closed all winter long. He felt a little suffocated at the thought, and almost jumped when Daddy dropped his hand on his shoulder. I'll get you that drink as soon as I can, Doc. They're a little busy right now. Sure, Dad. Mrs. Brant came out of the inner office looking vindicated. A few moments later, two bellboys, struggling with 8 suitcases between them, followed her as best they could as they strode triumphantly out the door. Danny watched through the window as a man in a gray uniform and a hat like a captain in the army brought her long silver car around to the door and got out. He tipped his cap to her and ran around to open the trunk. And in one of those flashes that sometimes came, he got a complete thought from her. One that floated above the confused, low-pitched babble of emotions and colors that he usually got in crowded places.
I'd like to get into his pants.
Danny's brow wrinkled as he watched the bellboys put her cases into the trunk. She was looking rather sharply at the man in the gray uniform who was supervising the loading. Why would she want to get into that man's pants? Was she cold? Even with that long fur coat on? And if she was that cold, why hadn't she just put on some pants of her own? His mommy wore pants just about all winter. The man in the gray uniform closed the trunk and walked back to help her into the car. Danny watched closely to see if she would say anything about his pants. She only smiled and gave him a $1 bill, a tip. A moment later, she was guiding the big silver car down the driveway. He thought about asking his mother why Mrs. Brant might want the carman's pants, and decided against it. Sometimes questions could get you in a whole lot of trouble. It happened to him before. So instead, he squeezed in between them on the small sofa they were sharing and watched all the people check out at the desk. He was glad his mommy and daddy were happy and loving each other, but he couldn't help being a little worried. He couldn't help it. Chapter 10. Halloran. The cook didn't conform to Wendy's image of the typical resort hotel kitchen personage at all. To begin with, such a personage was called a chef, nothing so mundane as a cook. Cooking was what she did in her apartment kitchen, when she threw all the leftovers into a greased Pyrex casserole dish and added noodles. Further, the culinary wizard of such a place as the Overlook, which advertised in the resort section of the New York Sunday Times, should be small, rotund, and pasty-faced, rather like the Pillsbury Doughboy. He should have a thin, pencil-lined mustache like a 40s musical comedy star, dark eyes, a French accent, and a detestable personality. Halloran had the dark eyes, and that was all. He was a tall black man with a modest afro that was beginning to powder white. He had a soft southern accent, and he laughed a lot, disclosing teeth too white and too even to be anything but 1950 vintage Sears and Roebuck dentures. Her own father had a pair which he called Roebuckers, and from time to time he would push them out at her comically at the supper table. Always, Wendy remembered now, when her mother was out in the kitchen getting something else or on the telephone. Danny had stared up at this black giant in a blue serge, and then had smiled when Halloran picked him up easily, set him on the crook of his elbow, and said, "You ain't gonna stay up here all winter." "Yes, I am," Danny said with a shy grin. "No, you're gonna come down to St. Pete's with me and learn to cook and go out on the beach every damn evening watching for crabs, right?" Danny giggled delightedly, and shook his head no. Halloran set him down. "If you're gonna change your mind," Halloran said, bending over him gravely, Hey, you better do it quick. 30 minutes from now, and I'm in my car. 2.5 hours after that, I'm sitting at Gate 32, Concourse B, Stapleton International Airport in the mile-high city of Denver, Colorado. 3 hours after that, I'm renting a car at the Miami. That's right, Miami Airport, and on my way to sunny St. Pete's. Waiting to get into my swim trunks and just laughing up my sleeve at anybody stuck and caught in the snow. Can you dig it, my boy?
Yes, sir,
Danny said, smiling. Halloran turned to Jack and Wendy. That looks like a fine boy there. Yeah, we think he'll do, Jack said and offered his hand. Halloran took it. I'm Jack Torrance, my wife Winifred. Danny, you've met. And a pleasure it was. Ma'am, are you a Winnie or a Freddie?
I'm a Wendy, she said, smiling.
Okay. Now that's better than the other two, I think. Right this way. Mr. Allman wants you to have the tour. The tour you'll get.
He shook his head and said under his breath,
and won't I be glad to see the last of him. Halloran commenced to tour them around the most immense kitchen Wendy had ever seen in her life. It was sparkling clean. Every surface was coaxed to a high gloss. It was more than just big, it was intimidating. She walked at Halloran's side while Jack, wholly out of his element, hung back a little with Danny. A long wall board hung with cutting instruments, which went all the way from paring knives to two-handed cleavers, hung beside a 4-basin sink. There was a breadboard as big as their Boulder Apartments kitchen table. An amazing array of stainless steel pots and pans hung from floor to ceiling, covering the whole wall.
I think I'll have to leave a trail of breadcrumbs every time I come in, she said.
Don't let it get you down, Halloran said. It's big, but it's still only a kitchen. Most of this stuff you'll never even have to touch. Keep it clean, that's all I ask. Now here's the stove I'd be using, if I was you. There are 3 of them in all, but this one's the smallest. Smallest, she thought dismally, looking at it. There were 12 burners, 2 regular ovens and a Dutch oven, a heated well on top in which you could simmer sauces or bake beans, a broiler and a warmer, plus a million dials and temperature gauges. All gas, Halloran said. You've cooked with gas before, Wendy.
Yes.
I love gas, he said, and turned on one of the burners. Blue flame popped into life, and he adjusted it down to a faint glow with a delicate touch. I like to be able to see the flame you're cooking with. You see where all the surface burner switches are?
Yes.
And the oven dials are all marked. Myself, I favor the middle one, because it seems to heat the most even. But you use whichever one you like, or all 3 for that matter.
A TV dinner in each one, Wendy said and laughed weakly.
Halloran roared. Go right ahead if you like. I left a list of everything edible over by the sink. You see it?
Here it is, Mommy.
Danny brought over 2 sheets of paper written closely on both sides. Good boy, Halloran said, taking it from him and ruffling his hair. You sure you don't want to come to Florida with me, my boy? Learn to cook the sweetest shrimp creole this side of paradise. Danny put his hands over his mouth and giggled, and retreated to his father's side. You 3 folk could eat up here for a year, I guess, Halloran said. We got a cold pantry, a walk-in freezer, all sorts of vegetable bins, and 2 refrigerators. Come on, let me show you. For the next 10 minutes, Halloran opened bins and doors disclosing food in such amounts as Wendy had never seen before. The food supplies amazed her, but did not reassure her much, as she might have thought. The Donner Party kept recurring to her, not with thoughts of cannibalism, With all this food, it would indeed be a long time before they were reduced to such poor rations as each other, but with a reinforced idea that this was indeed a serious business. When snow fell, getting out of here would not be a matter of an hour's drive to Sidewinder, but a major operation. They would sit up here in this deserted Grand Hotel, eating the food that had been left them like creatures in a fairy tale, and listening to the bitter wind around their snowbound eaves. In Vermont, when Danny had broken his arm, when Jack had broken Danny's arm, she had called the emergency medics squad, dialing the number from a little card attached to the phone. They had been at the house only 10 minutes later. There were other numbers written on that little card. You could have a police car in 5 minutes, and a fire truck in less time than that, but because the fire station was only 3 blocks away and 1 block over. There was a man to call if the lights went out, a man to call if the shower stopped up, a man to call if the TV went on the fritz. But what would happen up here if Danny had one of his fainting spells and swallowed his tongue? Oh God, what thought! What if the place caught on fire? If Jack fell down the elevator shaft and fractured his skull? What if we all have a wonderful time? Now stop it, Winifred. Halloran showed them into the walk-in freezer first, where their breath puffed out like comic strip balloons. In the freezer, it was as if winter had already come. Hamburger in big plastic bags, 10 pounds in each bag, a dozen bags. 40 whole chickens hanging from a row of hooks in the wood-planked walls. Canned hams stacked up like poker chips, a dozen of them. Below the chickens, 10 roasts of beef, 10 roasts of pork, and a huge leg of lamb. "You like lamb, Doc?" Halloran asked, grinning. "I love it," Danny said immediately. He had never had it. "I knew you did. There's nothing like 2 good slices of lamb on a cold night with some mint jelly on the side. You got mint jelly here, too. Lamb eases the belly. It's a non-contentious sort of meat." From behind them, Jack said curiously, "How do you know we call him Doc?" Halloran turned around. "Pardon?" "Danny, we call him Doc sometimes, like in the Bugs Bunny cartoons." "Hey, he looks like a doc. He looks sort of like a doc, doesn't he?" He wrinkled his nose at Danny, smacked his lips, and said, "What's up, Doc?" Danny giggled, and then Halloran said something. "Sure you don't want to go to Florida, Doc?" To him very clearly. He heard every word. He looked at Halloran, startled and a little scared. Halloran winked solemnly, turned back to the food. Wendy looked from the cook's broad serge-clad back to her son. She had the oddest feeling that something had passed between them. Something she could not quite follow. "You got 12 packages of sausage, 12 packages of bacon," Halloran said. "So much for the pig. In this drawer, 20 pounds of butter." "Real butter?" Jack asked. "The A #1. "I don't think I've had real butter since I was a kid back in Berlin, New Hampshire." "Well, you'll eat it up here until Olio seems a treat," Halloran said and laughed. "Over in this bin, you got your bread, 30 loaves of white, 20 of dark. We try to keep racial balance at the Overlook, don't you know? Now, I know 50 loaves won't take you through, but there's plenty of makings, and fresh is better than frozen any day of the week. Down here, you got your fish. Brain food, right, Doc?"
"Is it, Mom? If Mr. Halloran says so, honey." She smiled. Danny wrinkled his nose. "I don't like fish."
"You're dead wrong," Halloran said. "You just never had any fish that liked you. This fish here will like you fine. 5 pounds of rainbow trout, 10 pounds of turbot, 15 cans of tuna fish,
"Oh yeah, I like tuna."
and 5 pounds of the sweetest tasting sole that ever swam in the sea. My boy, when next spring rolls around, you're gonna think old
He snapped his fingers as if he had forgotten something.
What's my name now? I guess it just slipped my mind.
Mr. Halloran, Danny said, grinning. Dick to your friends.
That's right. And you being a friend, you make it Dick.
As he led them into the far corner, Jack and Wendy exchanged a puzzled glance, both of them trying to remember if Halloran had told them his first name.
And this here I put in special, Halloran said. Hope you folks enjoy it.
Oh, really, you shouldn't have, Wendy said, touched. It was a 20-pound turkey wrapped in a wide scarlet ribbon with a bow on top.
You gotta have your turkey on Thanksgiving, Wendy, Halloran said gravely. I believe there's a capon back here somewhere for Christmas. Doubtless you'll stumble on it. Now let's come out of here before we all catch the pneumonia. Right, Doc? The pneumonia.
Right.
There were more wonders in the cold pantry. 100 boxes of dried milk. Halloran advised her gravely to buy fresh milk for the boy and Sidewinder as long as it was feasible. 5 12-pound bags of sugar, a gallon jug of blackstrap molasses, cereals, glass jugs of rice, macaroni, spaghetti, ranked cans of fruit and fruit salad, a bushel of fruit apples, fresh apples, fruit apples, vegetable apples, and fresh apples that scented the whole room with autumn, dried raisins, prunes, and apricots. You gotta be regular if you want to be happy, Halloran said, and pealed laughter at the cold pantry ceiling, where one old-fashioned light globe hung down on an iron chain, a deep bin filled with potatoes, and smaller caches of tomatoes, onions, turnips, squashes, and cabbages.
My word, Wendy said as they came out, but seeing all that fresh food after her $30 a week grocery budget so stunned her that she was unable to say just what her word was.
I'm running a bit late,
Halloran said, checking his watch.
So I'll just let you go through the cabinets in the fridges as you get settled in. There's cheeses, canned milk, sweetened condensed milk, yeast, baking soda, a whole bag full of those table talk pies, a few bunches of bananas that ain't even near ripe yet.
Stop, she said, holding up a hand and laughing. I'll never remember it all. It's super, and I promise I'll leave the place clean.
And that's all I ask.
He turned to Jack.
Did Mr. Allman give you the rundown on the rats in his belfry?
Jack grinned. He said there were possibly some in the attic, and Mr. Watson said there might be some more down in the basement. There must be 2 tons of paper down there, but I didn't see any shredded, as if they'd been using any to make nests.
That's Watson,
Halloran said, shaking his head in mock sorrow.
Ain't he the foulest talking man you ever did run on?
He's quite a character, Jack agreed. His own father had been the foulest talking man Jack had ever run on.
It's sort of a pity,
Halloran said, leading them back toward the wide swinging doors that gave on their overlooked dining room.
There was money in that family long ago. It was Watson's granddad or great-granddad, I can't remember which, that built this place.
So I was told, Jack said.
What happened?
Wendy asked.
Well, they couldn't make it go,
Halloran said.
Watson will tell you the whole story, twice a day if you let him. The old man got a bee in his bonnet about the place. He let it drag him down, I guess. He had 2 boys, and one of them was killed in a riding accident on the grounds while the hotel was still a building. That would have been around 1908 or 09. The old man's wife died of the flu. And then it was just the old man and his youngest son. They ended up getting took on as caretakers in the same hotel the old man had built.
It is sort of a pity, Wendy said.
What happened to him, the old man? Jack asked.
He plugged his finger into a light socket by mistake, and that was the end of him, Halloran said. Sometime in the early 30s, before the Depression closed this place down for 10 years. Anyway, Jack, I'd appreciate it if you and your wife would keep an eye out for rats in the kitchen as well. If you should see them, traps, not poison.
Jack blinked. Of course. We'd want to put rat poison in the kitchen.
Halloran laughed derisively. Well, Mr. Ullman, that's who. That was his bright idea last fall. I put it to him, I said, what if we all get up here next May, Mr. Ullman, and I serve the traditional opening night's dinner, which just happens to be salmon in a very nice sauce, and everybody gets sick, and the doctor comes and says to you, Ullman, what you been up to doing up here? You got 80 of the richest folks in America suffering from rat poisoning.
Jack threw his head back and bellowed laughter. What did Ullman say? Halloran tucked his tongue into his cheek as if feeling for a bit of food in there.
Oh, he said, get some traps, Halloran.
This time they all laughed. Even Danny, although he was not completely sure what the joke was, except it had something to do with Mr. Ullman, who didn't know everything after all. Four of them passed through the dining room, empty and silent now, with its fabulous western exposure on the snow-dusted peaks. Each of the white linen tablecloths had been covered with a sheet of tough, clear plastic. The rug, now rolled up for the season, stood in one corner like a sentinel on guard duty. Across the wide room was a double set of bat-wing doors, and over them an old-fashioned sign lettered in gilt script, the Colorado Lounge. Following his gaze, Halloran said, if you're a drinking man, I hope you brought your own supplies. That place is picked clean. Employees' party last night, you know. Every maid and bellhop in the place is going around with a headache today, me included. I don't drink, Jack said shortly. They went back to the lobby. It had cleared greatly during the half hour they'd spent in the kitchen. The long main room was beginning to take on the quiet, deserted look that Jack supposed they would become familiar with soon enough. The high-backed chairs were empty. The nuns who had been sitting by the fire were gone. The fire itself was down to a bed of comfortably glowing coals. Wendy glanced out into the parking lot and saw that all but a dozen cars had disappeared. She found herself wishing they could get back into the VW and go back to Boulder, or anywhere else. Jack was looking around for Ullman, but he wasn't in the lobby. A young maid with her ash-blonde hair pinned up on her neck came over.
Your luggage is out on the porch, Dick.
Thank you, Sally.
He gave her a peck on the forehead.
You have yourself a good winter. Getting married, I hear.
He turned to the Torrances as she strolled away, backside twitching pertly.
I gotta hurry along now if I'm gonna make that plane. I want to wish you all the best. Know you'll have it.
Thanks, Jack said. You've been very kind.
I'll take good care of your kitchen, Wendy promised again. Enjoy Florida.
I always do, Halloran said. He put his hands on his knees and bent down to Danny. Last chance, guy. You want to come down to Florida?
I guess not,
Danny said, smiling.
Okay. Like to give me a hand out of my car with my bags?
If Mommy says I can. You can, Wendy said. But you'll have to have your jacket buttoned.
She leaned forward to do it, but Halloran was ahead of her. his large brown fingers moving with smooth dexterity.
I'll send 'em right back in,
Halloran said. Fine, Wendy said, and followed them to the door. Jack was still looking around for Ullman. The last of the Overlook's guests were checking out at the desk. Chapter 11. The Shining. There were 4 bags in a pile just outside the door. 3 of them were giant, battered old suitcases covered with black imitation alligator hide. The last was an oversized zipper bag with a faded tartan skin.
I guess you can handle all that one, can't you?
Halloran asked him. He picked up 2 of the big cases in one hand and hoisted the other under his arm. Sure, Danny said. He got a grip on it with both hands, followed the cook down the porch steps, trying manfully not to grunt and give away how heavy it was. A sharp and cutting fall wind had come up since they had arrived. It whistled across the parking lot, making Danny wince his eyes down to slits as he carried the zipper bag in front of him, bumping on his knees. A few errant aspen leaves rattled and turned across the now mostly deserted asphalt, making Danny think momentarily of that night last week when he had wakened out of his nightmare and had heard, or thought he had heard at least, Tony telling him not to go. Halloran had set his bags down by the trunk of a beige Plymouth Fury. This ain't much of a car, he confided to Danny. Just a rental job. My Bessie's on the other end. Now she's a car. 1950 Cadillac. And does she run sweet? I'll tell the world. I keep her in Florida because she's too old for all this mountain climbing. You need a hand with that. No, sir, Danny said. He managed to carry it the last 10 or 12 steps without grunting and set it down with a large sigh of relief. Good boy, Halloran said. He produced a large key ring from his pocket and unlocked the trunk. As he lifted the bags in, he said, You shine on, boy. Harder than anyone I ever met in my life. And I'm 60 years old this January. Huh? You got a knack, Halloran said, turning to him. Me? I've always called it shining. That's what my grandmother called it, too. She had it. We used to sit on the kitchen when I was a boy no older than you and have long talks without even opening our mouths. Really? Halloran smiled at Danny's open-mouthed, almost hungry expression and said, Come on up and sit in the car with me a few minutes. I want to talk to you. He slammed the trunk. In the lobby of the Overlook, Wendy Torrance saw her son get into the passenger side of Halloran's car as the big black cook slid in behind the wheel. A sharp pang of fear struck her, and she opened her mouth to tell Jack that Halloran had not been lying about taking her son to Florida. There was a kidnapping afoot. But they were only sitting there. She could barely see the small silhouette of her son's head, turned attentively toward Halloran's big one. Even at this distance, that small head had a set to it that she recognized. It was the way her son looked when there was something on the TV that particularly fascinated him, or when he and his father were playing old maid or idiot cribbage. Jack, who was still looking around for Ullman, hadn't noticed. Wendy kept silent, watching Halloran's car nervously, wondering what they could possibly be talking about that would make Danny cock his head that way. In the car, Halloran was saying, Get you kind of lonely thinking you were the only one. Danny, who had been frightened as well as lonely, sometimes nodded.
Am I the only one you ever met? He asked.
Halloran laughed and shook his head. No, child, no. But you shine the hardest.
Are there lots then?
No, Halloran said. But you do run across them. A lot of folks, they got a little bit of shine on them. They don't even know it. But they always seem to show up with flowers when their wives are feeling blue with the monthlies. They do good on school tests they don't even study for. They got a good idea how people are feeling as soon as they walk into a room. I come across 50 or 60 like that. Maybe only a dozen, counting my gram, that knew they was shining.
Wow, Danny said. Thought about it. Then, do you know Mrs. Brandt?
Her? Halloran asked scornfully. She don't shine. She just sends her supper back 2-3 times every night.
I know she doesn't, Danny said earnestly. But do you know the man in the gray uniform that gets the cars?
Mike? Sure I know Mike. What about him?
Mr. Halloran, why would she want his pants?
What are you talking about, boy?
Well, when she was watching him, she was thinking that she would sure like to get into his pants, and I just wondered why.
But he got no further. Halloran had thrown his head back, and rich, dark laughter issued from his chest, rolling around the car like cannon fire. The seat shook with the force of it. Danny smiled, puzzled, and at last the storm subsided by fits and starts. Halloran produced a large silk handkerchief from his breast pocket like a white flag of surrender, and wiped his streaming eyes. "Boy," he said, still snorting a little, "you're going to know everything there is to know about the human condition before you make 10. I don't know if to envy you or not."
But Mrs. Brandt?
"You never mind her," he said. "And don't go asking your mom either. You'd only upset her. Dig what I'm saying?"
Yes, sir, Danny said.
He dug it perfectly well. He had upset his mother that way in the past. "That Mrs. Brandt is just a dirty old woman with an itch. That's all you have to know." He looked at Danny speculatively. "How hard can you hit, Doc?"
Huh?
"Give me a blast. Think at me. I want to know if you got as much as I think you do."
What do you want me to think?
"Anything. Just think it hard."
Okay,
Danny said. He considered it for a moment, then gathered his concentration and flung it out at Halloran. He had never done anything precisely like this before, and at the last instant some instinctive part of him rose up and blunted some of the thought's raw force. He didn't want to hurt Mr. Halloran. Still, the thought arrowed out of him with a force he never would have believed. It went like a Nolan Ryan fastball, with a little extra on it. Gee, I hope I don't hurt him. And his thought was, "Hi, Dick!" Halloran winced and jerked backward on the seat. His teeth came together in a hard click, drawing blood from his lower lip in a thin trickle. His hands flew up involuntarily from his lap to the level of his chest and then settled back again. For a moment his eyelids fluttered limply, with no conscious control, and Danny was frightened.
Mr. Halloran? Dick, are you okay?
"I don't know," Halloran said and laughed weakly. "I honest to God don't. My God, boy, you're a pistol."
I'm sorry, Danny said, more alarmed. Should I get my daddy? I'll run and go get him.
No, here I come. I'm okay. I'm okay, Danny. You just sit right there.
I feel a little scrambled, that's all.
I didn't go as hard as I could, Danny confessed. I was scared to at the last minute.
Probably my good luck you did. My brains would be leaking out my ears. He saw the alarm on Danny's face and smiled. No harm done. What did it feel like to you?
Like I was Nolan Ryan throwing a fastball, he replied promptly.
You like baseball, do you?
Halloran was rubbing his temples gingerly. Daddy and me like the Angels, Danny said. The Red Sox in the American League East and the Angels in the West. He saw the Red Sox against Cincinnati in the World Series. I was a lot littler then, and Daddy was... Danny's face went dark and troubled.
Was what, Dan?
I forget, Danny said. He started to put his thumb in his mouth to suck it, but that was a baby trick. He put his hand back in his lap.
Can you tell me what your mom and dad are thinking, Danny?
Halloran was watching him closely. Most times, if I want to, but I usually don't try.
Why not?
Well... He paused a moment, troubled. It would be like peeking into the bedroom and watching while they're doing the thing that makes babies. Do you know that thing?
I have had acquaintance with it,
Halloran said gravely. They wouldn't like that, and they wouldn't like me peeking at their thinks. It would be dirty.
I see.
But I know how they're feeling, Danny said. I can't help that. I know how you're feeling too. I hurt you. I'm sorry.
It's just a headache. I've had hangovers that were worse.
Can you read other people, Danny? I can't read yet at all, Danny said, except a few words. But Daddy's going to teach me this winter. My daddy used to teach reading and writing in a big school. Mostly writing, but he knows reading too.
I mean, can you tell what someone else is thinking?
Danny thought about it. I can if it's loud, he said finally. Like Mrs. Brandt in the pants. Or like once when me and Mommy were in this big store to get some shoes, and there was this big kid looking at radios, and he was thinking about taking one without buying it. And then he'd think, what if I get caught? And then he'd think, I really want it. And then he'd think about getting caught again. He was making himself sick about it. And he was making me sick. Mommy was talking to the man who sells the shoes, so I went over and said, Kid, don't take that radio, go away. And he got real scared, and he went away fast. Halloran was grinning broadly.
I bet he did.
Can you do anything else, Danny?
Is it only thoughts and feelings, or is there more?
Cautiously.
Is there more for you?
Let me read that again. I get confused when they don't tell me who's saying what.
Cautiously. Is there more for you?
Sometimes, Halloran said. Not often. Sometimes. Sometimes there are dreams. Do you dream, Danny?
Sometimes, Danny said. I dream when I'm awake. After Tony comes... His thumb wanted to go back into his mouth again. He had never told anybody but Mommy and Daddy about Tony. He made his thumb-sucking hand go back into his lap.
Who's Tony?
And suddenly Danny had one of those flashes of understanding that frightened him most of all. It was like a sudden glimpse of some incomprehensible machine that might be safe or might be deadly dangerous. He was too young to know which. He was too young to understand.
What's wrong? He cried. You're asking me all this because you're worried, aren't you? Why aren't you worried about me? Why are you worried about us? I don't know who's talking, I'm sorry.
Halloran put his large, dark hands on the small boy's shoulders.
Stop, he said. It's probably nothing.
But if it's something, well, you got a large thing in your head, Danny. You have to do a lot of growing yet before you catch up to it, I guess. You gotta be brave about it.
But I don't understand things, Danny burst out. I do, but I don't. People, they feel things and I feel them, and I don't know what I'm feeling. He looked down at his lap wretchedly. I wish I could read. Sometimes Tony shows me signs and I can't hardly read any of them.
Who's Tony? Halloran asked again.
Mommy and Daddy call him my invisible playmate, Danny said, reciting the words carefully. But he's really real. At least, I think he is. Sometimes when I try real hard to understand things, he comes. He says, Danny, I want to show you something. And it's like I pass out, only there are dreams like you said. He looked at Halloran and swallowed. They used to be nice, but now I can't remember the word for dreams that scare you and make you cry.
Nightmares?
Halloran asked. Yes, that's right, nightmares.
About this place? About the Overlook?
Danny looked down at his thumb-sucking hand again. Yes, he whispered. Then he spoke shrilly, looking up into Halloran's face. But I can't tell my daddy, and you can't either. He has to have his job because it's the only one Uncle Al could get for him, and he has to finish his play, or he might start doing the bad thing again. I know what that is. It's getting drunk. That's what it is. It's when he used to always be drunk, and that was a bad thing to do. He stopped on the verge of tears.
Shh, Halloran said, and pulled Danny's face against the rough serge of his jacket. It smelled faintly of mothballs. That's all right, son. And if that thumb likes your mouth, you let it go where it wants. But his face was troubled. He said, What you got, son? I call it shining on. The Bible calls it having visions. And there's scientists that call it precognition. I've read up on it, son. I've studied on it. They all mean seeing the future. Do you understand that?
Danny nodded against Halloran's coat.
I remember the strongest shine I ever had that way. I'm not liable to forget. It was 1955. I was still in the army then, stationed overseas in West Germany. It was an hour before supper, and I was standing by the sink, giving one of the KPs hell for taking too much of the potato along with the peel. I says, Here, let me show you how it's done. He held out the potato and the peeler, and then the whole kitchen was gone. Bang, just like that. You say you see this guy Tony before you had dreams?
Danny nodded. Halloran put an arm around him.
Well, with me, it's smelling oranges. All that afternoon I've been smelling them and thinking nothing of it, 'cause they were on the menu for that night. Well, we had 30 crates of Valencias. Everybody in the damn kitchen was smelling oranges that night. For a minute, it was like I had just passed out. And then I heard an explosion. I saw flames. There were people screaming, sirens. And I heard this hissing noise that could only be steam. Then it seemed like, well, it got a little closer to whatever it was. And I saw a railroad car off the tracks lying on its side with Georgia and South Carolina Railroad written on it. And I knew like a flash that my brother Carl was on that train. And it jumped the tracks, and Carl was dead. Just like that. Then it was gone. And here's this scared, stupid little KP in front of me, still holding out that potato in the peeler. And he says, Are you okay, Sarge? And I says, No, my brother's just been killed down in Georgia. And when I finally got my mama on the overseas telephone, she told me how it was. But see, boy, I already knew how it was.
He shook his head slowly, as if dismissing the memory, and looked down at the wide-eyed boy.
But the thing you gotta remember, my boy, is this.
those things don't always come true. I remember just 4 years ago I had a job cooking at a boys' camp up in Maine on Long Lake. So I'm sitting by the boarding gate at Logan Airport in Boston, just waiting to get on my flight. I start smelling oranges again, for the first time in maybe 5 years. So I say to myself, my God, what's going to come on this crazy late show now? And I got down to the bathroom. I sat on one of the toilets to be private, you know. I never did black out, but I started getting this feeling stronger and stronger. My plane was going to crash. Then the feeling went away, and the smell of oranges, and I knew it was over. I went back to the Delta Airlines desk and changed my flight to one 3 hours later. You know what happened?
What? Danny whispered.
Nothing.
Halloran said, and laughed. He was relieved to see the boy smile a little too.
Not one single thing. That old plane landed right on time without a single bump or bruise. So you see, sometimes those feelings don't come to anything.
Oh, Danny said.
Or you take the racetrack. I go a lot, and I usually do pretty well. I stand by the rail when they go by the starting gate, and sometimes I get a little shine about this horse or that one. Usually those feelings help me get real well. I always tell myself someday I'm gonna get 3 once or 3 long shots and make enough on the trifecta to retire early. Ain't happened yet. I come home there's plenty of times I'll come home from the track on Shank's mare instead of in a taxi cab with my wallet swollen up. Nobody shines on all the time, except maybe for God up in heaven.
Yes, sir, Danny said, thinking of the time almost a year ago when Tony had showed him a new baby lying in a crib at their house in Stovington. He had been very excited about that and had waited knowing that it took time, but there had been no new baby.
Now you listen,
Halloran said, and took both of Danny's hands in his own.
I've had some bad dreams here, and I've had some bad feelings. I've worked here 2 seasons now. Maybe a dozen times I've had, nightmares. And maybe half a dozen times I thought I'd seen things. No, I won't say what. It ain't for a little boy like you. Just nasty things, you know. Once it had something to do with those damned hedges clipped looked like animals. Another time there was a maid, Dolores Vickery her name was, and she had a little shine to her, but I don't think she knew it. Mr. Allman fired her. You know what that is, Doc?
Yes, sir, Danny said candidly. My daddy got fired from his teaching job, and that's why we're in Colorado, I guess.
Well, Allman fired her on account of her saying she'd seen something in one of the rooms where a bad thing happened. That was in room 217. And I want you to promise me, Danny, you will never go in there. Not all winter. Steer right clear.
All right, Danny said. Did the lady, the maiden, did she ask you to go look?
Yes, she did. And there was a bad thing there. But I don't think it was a bad thing that could hurt anyone, Danny. That's what I'm trying to say. People who shine, they can sometimes see things that are gonna happen. And I think sometimes they can see things that did happen. Well, they're just like pictures in a book. Did you ever see a picture in a book that scared you, Danny?
Yes, he said, thinking of the story of Bluebeard, and the picture where Bluebeard's new wife opens the door and sees all the heads.
But you knew it couldn't hurt you, didn't you?
Yes, Danny said, and a little dubious.
Well, that's how it is in this hotel. I don't know why, but it seems that all the bad things that ever happened here, there's little pieces of those things still lying around like fingernail clippings or the boogers that somebody nasty just wiped under a chair. I don't know why I should just be here. There's bad goings on in just about every hotel in the world, I guess. I worked in a lot of them and had no trouble. Only here. But Danny, I don't think those things can hurt anybody.
He emphasized each word in the sentence with a mild shake of the boy's shoulders.
So if you should see anything, if you should see something in a hallway or a room or outside by those hedges, just look the other way. And when you look back, it'll be gone. Are you digging me?
Yes, Danny said. He felt much better, soothed. He got up on his knees, kissed Halloran's cheek, and gave him a big hard hug. Halloran hugged him back. When he released the boy, he asked,
Your folks, they don't shine, do they?
No, I don't think so.
I tried them like I did you, Halloran said. Your mama jumped the tiniest bit. I think all mothers shine a little bit, you know. At least until their kids grow up enough to watch out for themselves. Your dad...
Halloran paused momentarily. He had probed at the boy's father, and he just didn't know. It wasn't like meeting someone who had the shine, or someone who definitely did not. Poking at Danny's father had been strange, as if Jack Torrance had something that he was hiding, or something he was holding in so deeply submerged in himself that it was impossible to get to.
I don't think he shines at all, Halloran finished. So you don't worry about them. You just take care of you. I don't think there's anything here that can hurt you. So just be cool, okay?
Okay.
Danny. Hey, Doc.
Danny. Hey, Doc. Danny looked around. Well, that's Mom. She wants me. I have to go.
I know you do, Halloran said. You have a good time here, Danny. Best you can, anyway.
I will. Thanks, Mr. Halloran. I feel a lot better. The smiling thought came in his mind.
Dick to my friends.
Yes, Dick, okay. Their eyes met, and Dick Halloran winked. Danny scrambled across the seat of the car and opened the passenger side door. As he was getting out, Halloran said,
Danny,
What?
if there is trouble, you give a call. A big loud holler like the one you gave me a few minutes ago. I might hear you, even way down in Florida. And if I do, I'll come on the run.
Okay, Danny said and smiled.
You take care, big boy.
I will. Danny slammed the door and ran across the parking lot toward the porch, where Wendy stood holding her elbows against the chill wind. Halloran watched, the big grin slowly fading.
I don't think there's anything here that can hurt you. I don't think.
But what if he was wrong? He had known that this was the last season at the Overlook ever since he had seen that thing in the bathtub of room 217. It had been worse than any picture in any book. And from here, the boy running to his mother looked so small.
I don't think.
His eyes drifted down to the topiary animals. Abruptly, he started the car and put it in gear and drove away, trying not to look back. And of course he did. And of course the porch was empty. They had gone back inside. It was as if the Overlook had swallowed them.